On this episode of Thinking Through, Dr. Allison Lester is joined by two of the sharpest voices cutting through AI hype, linguist Dr. Emily M. Bender and sociologist Dr. Alex Hanna, co-authors of the AI Con, How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want. At a time when AI is sold as all-knowing and unavoidable, Emily and Alex offer a countervoice. They clarify what these tools actually do, name the costs the hype tends to erase, and explore what resistance can look like in classrooms, workplaces, and everyday life.
Well, thank you, Emily and Alex, for being on the show.
So happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So good. My heart's racing a little bit because I have a confession. I feel like I need to confess to you both.
That's okay. Don't worry about it.
Well, I got conned by AI.
What happened?
So I got conned by the AI hype when ChatGPT was first released. The ease of writing emails in seconds. Yes, please. Thank you. Especially those emails that are so mundane and so boring and so soul-sucking. And then being in academia, writing can be so lonely and isolating, and having a chatbot just like cheer me on and help me get unstuck and be a more robust search engine. Oh my God. Thank you.
So it's not a more robust search engine.
But I also
it felt like it. Hey,
but I also want to start
like
off.
Right?
Well, I want to too with just talking about it too. Like, first off, like, don't feel bad or don't feel like you need to confess. I feel like we do a lot of these discussions that people are like, I have to confess, I use ChatGPT, and we're like, okay, like, it's understandable. Like, people are under time crunches. It's hard to write, and academic writing is very lonely. And it also is like, we have to remember that we're writing as part of a writing community. And, you're always writing with someone, even if you're writing alone. I'll also say you gave a confession. I'll also give you a confession. I feel like I've been not reading as closely as I need to, maybe in the past 5 years. And part of it is I'm also pressed for time. Yeah. And I'm actually sort of making this kind of effort to read more slowly because one of the things I think has been really helpful in writing this book is to think about what language is. And Emily, is the linguist here. And so I'll let her talk more about what language is and what communication is and what text is. But I think a lot of it is taking seriously what language is and what the intention is of people who are writing this. And if you're taking that very seriously, it makes you a different kind of reader.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that it's every time someone says, can I use it for this, or is it okay to use it for that, or we just got done with the conversation where every other question was, but what about? It was so frustrating. But each time there's a real need there, right? So you identified soul-sucking email, and there I think the need is, well, how do we create space as academics or as students, like anybody who's engaging in scholarship, to really have the time to do the part that we're here for amidst all of these things that feel like we have to do. And it's, of course, much harder to do that structural work, to open up that space. And in the moment, sometimes the thing is, I just got to get this email done. So that's one set of needs. There's the how to find and feel the community in writing when in the moment physically it's you and your keyboard or you and your notebook, if that's how you start. And Alex is right that when you read as someone who's really thinking about, okay, someone was making choices of those words, what were they doing, how do I relate to this? That is a way of finding community, and I think that can carry over into writing. And there's other ways to build community around writing. I know the students in my department do something they call Shut Up and Write, where they get together into a room and they do the Pomodoro method, where they all shut up and they do their thing for 25 minutes and then 5 minutes of socializing. Or you can have an accountability buddy, so you can report to somebody, hey, I got this much done, or I didn't get anything done, or whatever, right? So there are ways to create community. I want to set the search engine thing aside, though, as different, because I think that there are many issues with using the large language models across applications. But if your task at hand is get the email done, or help me get past the blank page, I think they are functional for those purposes. I wouldn't recommend it, but I think it actually, when you've done the thing, you haven't been misled into it being done when it's not done, right? But the search choice is actually a really pernicious presentation of the technology. And It's basically set up as if it had access to the whole web and it can just answer your question, and that saves you the hard work of like figuring out which the links, first of all, aren't spam, and then finding on the page the part that answers your question. But the problem is that if you don't do that, you don't actually have any information, because you don't know where those words came from, and you don't know their context, and you don't know how to interpret them, because back to Alex's point about being a close reader, we make sense of things based in part on how we understand them to have come into the world. And the myth around ChatGPT is that it is this all-knowing answer engine that somehow sits in this omniscient view from nowhere, which doesn't exist. But if we engage with it that way, then we are really setting ourselves up to become further misinformed.
I'm curious, how would you describe what an LLM actually is without the hype language?
We have got words for it. One of our favorites is synthetic text extruding machine. And the sort of quick way to talk about this is everyone's got predictive text on their phone, right? And I think everyone's played the game where you type in, "I'm sorry, I'm late, and then you just pick the middle option over and over again and sort of see what it comes out with. That's effectively what ChatGPT is doing, but it's doing it sort of behind this wrapper of being designed to simulate conversation so that it feels like you are talking to something as opposed to just what's the next word, what's the next word, what's the next word.
Okay. I'm thinking about what within that space and holding that definition, what do students and teachers need to know most about what these tools do and don't, zeroing in on that.
Yeah, I mean, the starting point is they aren't understanding anything you're putting in. You've put in something, and then what the system is processing is actually what you've entered, plus a long hidden system prompt that the user doesn't get to see, and then outputting based on its training data, likely next word, likely next word. So it is designed to look like it's understanding and having a conversation with you, but it absolutely is not. I think the second thing is that even if you have a version of it where you're giving it some specific documents and trying to ask questions about those documents, sometimes people think that that means that it's going to only say things that are true from the documents, but it doesn't work that way. Right? It is making collage or paper mache out of those input documents, and the glue of the paper mache is all of the rest of the documents in its training data. So all that stuff might come leaking in. You can have things sort of twisted and put together in weird ways. And ultimately, if you're trying to get a summary of a document, for example, even if every last thing that came out in the summary were true of the document, you can check that pretty quickly. But to check that it didn't miss anything important, you have to go read the first document.
Yeah, and would just add this to say that it's not like it's a database of kind of truth claims that it accesses it, because it's what is likely to come next. There is words that are likely to come next, and it doesn't have to follow any kind of structure of argumentation, or even in uses of doing things like summarizing. There's no guarantee that it's going to summarize them in a way that is necessarily true. It's just that the tokens that come next are more likely. And so a lot of that important work that you do in education, whether it's coming up with some ideas or summarizing a document or checking sources, I mean, that's all the critical work that you're doing in teaching and learning. I mean, there's no guarantee that you're going to get correct outputs at all from these tools. So that's an important thing to consider. I'm thinking a lot about this on the student end. On the teacher end, you can think about this in the same kind of way, the same kinds of setup. Like if you were going to say, I've seen propositions that suggest, well, maybe we could use these to develop lesson plans. Well, what's going to be the case in are you actually going to get an output that matches what the initial prompt of the lesson plan is? If your learning objective is to, do X, Y, Z. Are these questions going to actually support those learning goals, or are they going to effectively find what, in the best instance, it is going to plagiarize a lesson plan that is already in the training data. In the worst instance, it is going to come up with things which are in kind of counter to one's own learning objectives. So at that case, does it make sense to even use this thing in such a case unless you are radically revising the outputs of this at the end of it.
Totally. That just made me think of what gets masked in the way when we talk about AI. What are the stories or the realities that are completely deleted, and you mentioned that. And I'm also thinking about labor and data extraction and surveillance and environmental impact. And what do people need to know about the tech that they might not hear from the AI hype talking points?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe, Alex, I'll take the environmental side and leave the labor side to you this time, but we talk about these things as being in the cloud. Here, folks like Nathan Logler and Batya Friedman and Alan Borning talk about how this metaphor of the cloud sounds clean and fluffy and ephemeral, when in fact the cloud is data centers. And data centers are big buildings, like enormous buildings, full of machines that need a lot of electricity, both for doing the computations and for cooling the systems, and also need clean water to do that cooling. Mm-hmm. And they tend to be sited not where electricity and clean water are abundant, but where they are poorly regulated. I was just, Alex and I both got to speak with a reporter in, I think, Albuquerque, where
Tucson.
Tucson.
I was going to say, that sounds like Tucson, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in the desert, right? He was reporting on a proposed data center there, and the company that was putting in the data center, wasn't saying who they were going to be selling the compute time to. They were also claiming that they were somehow going to be putting more water into the community system than they used, to which, how? It's the desert. Where are they going to get this water, right? But these companies sort of go in and make all these big promises, and the regulatory authority, unfortunately, many times have said, sure, that sounds great, and it sounds like it's going to bring jobs, right? It's tech. Well, it's actually bringing very few jobs. And what happens is you get these horrible stories of really water-stressed areas where the water ends up going to cool the chips in the data center and then can't be returned, right? So that is fresh drinking water that is being slurped up by these systems. And really, to what end? And data centers predate this AI craze.
So, with regards to the labor element of it, so much of the labor that is needed to make the system work at all is done typically in the majority world, also called the global south. And this labor is often sifting through kind of the worst of what these systems have to offer. So it's often violent content, is content describing how to build weapons, describing awful sexual acts, describing really terrible and gory and violent situations. And there's this process which is called reinforcement learning with or from human feedback? Reinforcement learning from human feedback. Doesn't really matter. But it is a process in which outputs of large language models can be changed if human raters are actually labeling whether these things are good or bad. And so many of these people who are doing this work have to read that content, try to come up with some kind of alternative, and then feed it back into the system. In some cases, work as what are called red teamers. And so they are reading the content, and then they are actually posing prompts that are supposed to be very awful. They're like, tell me how to build a bomb, tell me how to do self-harm. And they have to think about these in very kind of twisted and imaginative ways. And so that's another way in which this labor is being done by thousands of people, typically in Kenya, Venezuela, Colombia, India. And then there's also the aspect of it where there are cases in which these technologies aren't as automated as they seem. They are actually cases in which they are pretending to operate as robots or as automated systems. And so there was an admission from Kyle Voigt, who was the CEO of Cruise, which is a self-driving car company. And the New York Times had reported that there was basically humans doing some of the driving in the cases in which the automated vehicle wasn't able to negotiate a certain scenario. And then he defended the company by admitting on Hacker News, which is a popular news site in Silicon Valley, a sort of forum, that no, we only have to do that about 2 to 4% of the time. And that's still quite a lot if you're envisioning, the amount of hours these things are driven. And so there's a lot of these cases in which there are humans actually very much involved in this, despite the sheen of automation.
It just makes me curious about what kind of cognitive dissonance we have to do to block out the sticky ethics, the kind of the dark underbelly of the tech that we're engaging with. I'm just sitting with.
I think part of that is wrapped up in this like discourses of it's inevitable, everybody's doing it, that's just the way it is. And I think we're at a really interesting juncture with this, because if you compare this, usage of these systems to usage of plastic, right? We are now at a point where plastic is completely integrated into all of our systems around us. And if you wanted to try to avoid using plastic at all, that's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money. The world is not set up for you to avoid using plastic. The tech companies are trying really hard to make their so-called AI systems similarly ubiquitous, right? You can't start Zoom or your email client or LinkedIn without, or Adobe, like, here, do you want AI summarizing of this document that you're trying to read? Like, no, I don't. But you don't actually need any of that. It's a little bit in the way, but you can still do all the things you were trying to do without it. And so I feel like we're at an interesting moment where the resistance really matters. That if we refuse to use it and we maintain the habits of going with, doing things manually, then we can resist sort of this synthetic text system becoming as thoroughly embedded in everything as plastic has.
Unfortunately, computing is quite implicated in all of that. We really couldn't have the devices that we work on every day if it weren't for extraction of cobalt or the 3 T's of tin, and I forgot the other two, but the big three that are typically mined in the Congo and in some conflict zones. And so, I mean, one of the kind of features of foregrounding this is to know that, well, this is a technology that you really don't need.
Yeah.
And there's a whole supply chain of exploited labor involved in this. Is there a way that we can, depress that need or ensure that isn't something that we're implicated in?
It makes me think of, Emily, you used the word resist, and in that thinking of agency and collective resistance, I'm wondering if you can kind of help name like how people can resist, or what do we need to know that's out there and I'm thinking about my students, who've grown up in the world of algorithmic control and tech and may not know that there's agency there.
Yeah. So one of the things that I find sort of most pernicious in a lot of this discourse is the discourse of inevitability. This is what people will say, well, even if you don't like it, the stuff is here to stay, so you have to learn how to use it. Or, well, today's students are going to be graduating into a workforce and into a workplace where they're expected to know how to use this. And
I hear that all the time.
Yeah. And those discourses are, I think, really a bid to steal our agency, because the future's not written, right? And so I think it is valuable and it can be hard, right? But every time you have a chance to say, no, actually, I don't want to use that, or no, I don't think we have to, or no, I think there's another way, that opens up a little bit more room for you or somebody else to do it again the next time. So, that might be both just sort of like, I refuse to do that. And in some ways it feels, in that position feels a little bit like being vegetarian. No, I don't eat meat, right? And there are cultures and places where that is completely normal, and cultures and places where it's actually really hard to be vegetarian and people treat you as weird and stuff like that. But then the moment you meet someone else who is too, and you can sort of work together, and the 5th time that at a restaurant someone's asked for a vegetarian meal, they sort of, it becomes a more normal request and stuff like that.
So I'm thinking of tech platforms that are doing it well, that ones that we should know about, ones that, we should be supporting. So what's out there? Yeah.
Signal for messaging and chat.
Yeah.
And there was a hilarious moment a couple of weeks ago where Meredith Whittaker, who is the president or CEO, the leader of that company.
President, yeah.
Someone said, Signal's going to be adding AI in soon too. And she replied, this is on social media, no, with a heart. And the person says, no, they are. And she's like, you're talking to the president of the company. And
Yeah.
this guy, it was a guy just like dug in and wouldn't stop. But no, so Signal is a fantastic platform for chat. It's nice and secure, and it is absolutely not doing the AI thing. That's one example.
Yeah, Signal is a great example, and I think one of the background on that is also because Meredith is also a very sharp thinker when it comes to AI. There was a video that went a little viral a couple weeks ago about her talking about this notion of this AI agent and agentic AI, in which something that she had said was like, well, what you're sort of doing, you're getting into an area is a place where she phrased it very well, and I'm going to do a terrible job of trying to recall that, but you're breaching this kind of blood-brain barrier of having this separation of the application level and the OS level. Effectively, you're allowing some kind of a software to make OS controls, and you cannot have any privacy guarantees in that case, and that's actually going to breach many of that. And I thought that was a very astute observation. And so she's thought quite a lot on thinking about both AI as an industry and what AI and the sort of capture of certain of the research of this, as well as how this works in practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to circle back to Meredith Whitaker for a moment about that data extraction, because I remember seeing that viral video too, where and I also am like I'm pulling it from memory. I'm trying to do it, but it was something about how it's sold to us as this utopic dream. Like, imagine an AI that can plan your friend's birthday weekend, book the flights, find the Airbnb, book the dinner, know their dietary restrictions, check your shared calendar when you all can do it, and split the costs. But for that to happen, it needs access to everything: your calendar, your contacts, your private messages, your location history, your financial limits, like all the data. And I worry that most people don't fully understand what level of data access that kind of automation actually requires. So I'm wondering, this is like a little bit facetious, are we already past the point of caring about data overreach? How do we make, I guess, a nicer question is how do we make visible the cost of that convenience, especially to students who are growing up inside systems where data extraction is normalized?
Yeah. I have the sense that there's already been something of a tide shift on sharing images of ourselves online, that my generation was much more, let's put all the pictures up, Gen Z and Gen Alpha. And there's, of course, tension between people my kids' age who had pictures of them plastered by their parents, right? And it's like, wait a minute, I didn't have a choice on that. Yeah. So, and I would never think that that we can't turn back, right? Past the point of no return is if you get to the point on climate change where we are run away towards Venus. That's a sort of no return sort of situation.
Or Mars,
Yeah. But in terms of, can we change culture around this? I think we can. And one of the things we talk about in the book is the idea of data minimization, that we can set up norms, and this can be both, eventually regulation, but also the idea that you really want only the data that is necessary to do the transaction, and only for as long as it's necessary.
I would also say that there's, speaking to students and thinking about that, how they move through the world, there's this line that I was in this lovely, session on Monday with students involved in this Labs of Liberation project that Moya Bailey and Amy Hamarai put together. And one of the things that they had suggested was this kind of notion of an orientation of what they called against data fatalism. So this idea that, or against tech fatalism. And I kind of extending that to sort of against data fatalism, effectively this idea of it's that you shouldn't just say, privacy's dead, no one cares about privacy, because I think we're kind of framing it in a way where privacy itself, in this era in the U.S. is very peaked, especially as so much about us is being used against us in very peaked, situations of state violence. And so I think we're having this, this period, as Emily suggested, of there's a little more, idea of like, well, your data is being used and can be weaponized in this particular way, not only by the state, but also by companies and other types of organizations. And I mean, and I don't know how much, that resonates with, a lot of people, but I think there's also a notion that, there's a sort of creepiness factor around it that I think is helpful.
If I can bring in a scary example, if you think about, it's very handy to have a period tracking app, right? Keep track of what's going on. But that data combined with now the national patchwork of abortion laws can be quite scary. And there's stories of people, or stories or fears anyway, of if you're late and you've now recorded that information, you could end up in a situation where what's actually just a late period or maybe a miscarriage is criminalized. And you've got this data trail that authorities could try to use against you. So I think that's a very visceral thought for many of us. And what you were doing with the data tracking in the first place really ought to have been the kind of thing that could be done where the data stays just locally with you, right? There's no reason for that to be centralized, except that so much of this is predicated on amassing and selling data. And so again, every act of resistance, I think, helps open up new possibilities.
Yeah, I want to take that and bring it into the classroom space about, because I'm just thinking as we're preparing for fall semester and course is going to be launched, what do we need to do differently in how we talk about technology or engage with it in the classroom space?
You're the one that's going into the classroom this fall, and so
Yes.
I unfortunately am not. I actually wanted to be, but I'm not. So I'll let you start. Yeah.
So I think that I think we need to acknowledge that students are coming into a really confusing set of mixed signals, where on the one hand they're being told you can't cheat using ChatGPT, and on the other hand it's like, but we're the AI university and we're going to give you access to all of these things. And it's like, what's going on there? And the conversation that I have with my students, the sort of background to this is I never want to be in the position of having to police what my students are doing, because that interrupts the relationship of teaching. And so my goal isn't to, sometimes people will say, oh, so you think it should be banned? I'm like, no, I think that ChatGPT does not help people learn. And so I want to do my best to set up a classroom environment where students have the time and the space to do activities that are meaningful for their learning. And I'm able to make it clear to them why those activities are meaningful for their learning. And, that's, if someone finds that they are the only thing they can do in the moment because they're so busy with work or they've got too many classes or whatever is, get a fake essay extruded out of ChatGPT, then no learning has happened. And, if I spend time providing feedback on that, then there's no value to that either, right? So I would much rather have students come to me and say, look, I really don't have time. Like, what can we do here?
Yeah.
And to really try to keep the focus on the goal is not the grades, and that can be really hard because there's so many systems that are set up around grades, but the goal is the learning, and how do we set this up so that it works for you, the student, to do the learning in this class that you have hopefully chosen to be in. And it's even harder in classes where the students aren't really there by choice, but hopefully we can look at the bigger choice that brought them to the institution that led to them taking that class.
Yeah, I mean, I just plus one to everything Emily is saying. I want to really emphasize, I think there's a notion that like, well, are you going to ban these technologies? And I'm like, well, banning probably is not going to work. Also, it's going to set up this situation where if a student is using these technologies, then you have to report them for some kind of an academic misconduct infraction. You're just setting up students to fail in that case, right? You're policing your classroom. You are not really doing it. No one likes those proceedings. And the university is really unclear on that. The university is sort of saying, well, if you use it in this kind of way, it's academic misconduct. And yet we're going to provide you a site license for ChatGPT, or we're going to have, whatever. And I was on a call yesterday with some folks from University of Michigan, and Michigan has their own version of a chatbot, as most large universities do these days. And so you're getting mixed messaging right here. And I think, like, what can you do as an instructor and an educator to change the conditions in the classroom, to understand, to make clear what the grounds are for what the learning objectives are, and making it such that, well, if you use a chatbot for this, you're going to be controverting you're sabotaging yourself, right?
Yeah, totally. I'm really grateful for that framing and kind of being able to go into the classroom thinking about that and slowing it down, of how do you really preserve the relationship at the heart of it, the center of it. And through that, how you're going to be able to have the good learning, like you mentioned, Emily, of just model what it feels like, and the experience of engaging with it, and what it feels like to not be in a punitive policing state, surveillance of use, but just the relational understanding.
And the classrooms are at their best when we are learning together. And one of the tropes of sort of selling chatbots as personalized tutors is, well, every student gets their own personalized thing. And I've heard people say, well, one-to-one is the gold standard. I'm like, I don't think so. I think actually a classroom being a community of learners is a really important part of it.
It's powerful.
And that, there's a wonderful phrase that we took from the Dean of Arts at the University of Washington, which is, a lot of this is about being human together. And even writing an essay and then having someone read it and give you feedback is part of being human together and learning together. And part of the joy of teaching is sort of being on that journey with the students. And so trying to bring that forward and help make the students feel comfortable in it and eager for it is, I think, the primary goal.
Yeah. Okay, I want to switch gears for a little bit, because y'all have been hard to keep track of where where you've been. Y'all are in different parts of the world, and Emily, you're in Cambridge. Alex, you're constantly in conversations and booked and busy. I'm just seeing dance cards are full. And I mean, to list off all where you've been for your book release and more would take the entire show. I mean, that's just it. I just, have roll credits and just where you're all going. And I was, I'm in San Francisco, and last night went down to City Lights and saw your I'll have a nicer image of.
We did an event there with Kari Johnson. I'm also in the Bay Area.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So I'm local. We did 4 events in the Bay Area.
And City Lights was the first, wasn't it? That was our very first in-person book event,
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, City Lights, and then we spoke at San Jose State. Then we spoke in Guerneville, which was a fun event, and then we spoke in Oakland.
Yeah.
And then, has there been something? I feel like there was another.
So we did Seattle,
I did.
and then we did the Midwest.
And then I did Writers with Drinks with Charlie on Saturday with Charlie Jane Anders at Strut in the Castro. So we've been doing a lot of Bay Area, and we're doing a lot of Seattle events, because that's where Emily usually is.
Yes.
Oh,
a part of the story that I love telling is that we had a lot of fun sort of doing that together. We did a road trip through the Midwest too, but Alex and I first started working together in 2020 as part of a group of people who were working together online on some research papers. And then our collaboration continued into our podcast, Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000. We wrote some op-eds together. We wrote a whole book together. And then in March of 2025, we finally met in person. And that was also in the Bay Area, because I was down in Mountain View for an event at the Computer History Museum, and Alex showed up, and it was fun to hey, wait, you're a real 3D person.
I know. And Emily, not to put you on blast, Emily, but you are as short as you say. But you have. I will say you have.
You've got tall energy.
You have tall person energy. Yes, 100%.
Tall, totally.
People say this about me, but yeah, no, I'm short.
I love it. With your road trips and everything that you've been doing, I'm really curious about how you've been in so many different spaces, and I'm curious about what are you noticing, what conversations have stayed with you? Are there moments that raised new alarms or made you think, oh, okay, book number 2 needs to be about this. We need to talk about this whole thing. So I'm curious about what tensions or patterns are emerging that maybe even caught you by surprise?
So we had both done a lot of media work, a lot of appearing on other people's podcasts even before this. And I mean, for me, a lot of this activity started with arguing with people on Twitter in the late 2010s. And so I think a lot has been familiar, and it's a mix of people who are like, thank you, I found my people. I'm not the only one who thinks this way. This is reassuring. This is exciting. And then at the in-person book events, somehow there is usually one person who wants to be the reply guy, who got themselves to the venue and sat through the whole talk just so they can be the reply guy. But there's usually only one of him. at each event. And the other thing that I've
Universally a him, we should say.
Yes, yes. Reply guy is not a gender neutral version of guy. The size of the audience seems to be growing as time goes on. And that's been interesting to me. And I don't know if that's just like the book has generated some buzz, or if we've gotten better at advertising events, or if the events we've done outside the US draw more people, because I don't know, we'll be back in Seattle in October. It'll be interesting to see how that one goes.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about things that have been most enlightening in this. There's, we often, I think, fixate on the reply guys, but there's also been a lot of really interesting cases. And one of the things I think is most helpful in these conversations, and this is something kind of bringing to other work, which is the ways in which people are dealing with these tools in different types of work situations. So people say, well, I have to deal with this with my job on my job now. I have to do this at my school. What do I do here? I need some help here, or I'm being told I need to do this. And some people say, I'm dealing with this and I'm going to try to work with it. But a lot of people, many more people say, my boss is really taken with this and I would really like some way to push against this. In some cases, we've had people, I had a teammate of mine say, I gave my boss this book and he's just been blown away with this. And he stopped using the tools at work, which is kind of the best solution. But I mean, there's also, also cases where you're like, well, this is becoming more of an imposition. And we're seeing a lot more of that. I think the president of Axel Springer, there was some reporting, which is a huge publisher in Germany, said, employees must use chatbots on the job now. So it's becoming more and more of kind of this forced compliance. And I also think that's why the book is finding more an audience too.
Yeah, goes back to that resistance. I have one last question that we always ask as we end. What's one question you hope we're asking about AI a decade from now?
What were they thinking?
Oh, you got my snort laugh, Emily.
Yay!
No, I really, that was a little bit snide, but I actually really do hope that right now we're in this moment where it feels like the future as envisioned by Sam Altman and Elon Musk and Demis Hassabis and all these folks is the future, and that's the one we're all running towards. And I know that that's not true, right? What hatched out of their imaginations doesn't have to be what the rest of us end up with. They have a lot of money and they have a lot of power from that money, but that doesn't mean their ideas are good or practical or anything like that. And so I do believe that at some point this is going to look ridiculous in hindsight. So yes, I would love to be asking, what were they thinking?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think that, Lord, it's hard to think about what we are going to be saying 10 years from now about AI. I mean, I feel like, if past is prologue, I mean, what we were saying 10 years ago about, big data, there's many of the same kinds of things where like you need to know what big data is. And the way that it's kind of ended up is that it's sort of, the hype around big data has calmed down. Now it's just data analytics. And I think this is a little more dangerous given that the huge amount of investment in data centers and the amount of jobs which are being slashed with the promise of being replaced with large language models and text extrusion machines. So I'm assuming I'm hoping 10 years from now I'll be like, God, that was a bad idea. Let's not do that again.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for being on the show. This has been so lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for excellent questions.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.